Hey, sorry, I need to go get. I was getting some coffee. Need to stay awake.
Yeah, I could present you a little bit. Meanwhile, David Lee is the executive director of Shenzhen Open Innovation Lab, which facilitates the collaboration between global smart hardware entrepreneurs and the Shenzhen Open Innovation ecosystem. He was co-founder of Hacker Matter, a research hub on maker movement and open innovation. So I think that I am just saying some words about 10 years ago, David. So could you give us an update about your current activities and projects?
Yeah. So for the past probably 5 years, we have been running the Shenzhen Open Innovation Lab. We're also the Fed Lab Shenzhen. So we did the Fed Talk in 2016. And for the past couple years, we have been looking at the intersection between the maker movement and the industrial activity, looking at how what we see as a maker movement, what I would characterize as the ordinary people getting access to knowledge through the internet, getting access to the tour of productions, and getting the partners, meeting the partners to cooperate. And that's one thing we see how the Fed Lab network or makerspace work. But we step back here and looking at this in a much larger scale, in the industrial scale. So for the past 10 years, we've been publishing on how this industrialization of the three principles would work. So we started by looking at Shenzhen, where we base. And for those who probably, for those who haven't heard of Shenzhen, if you have access to anything with a battery and with a screen, 90% of the chance is made in Shenzhen. That's where we are, the capital of the production of the ICT products. Shenzhen gets there not because of this, Shenzhen gets there because of this huge grassroots movement of people working with each other, with a very free style in terms of how the technology is shared, how the knowledge is shared, and with hundreds of thousands of factories around here. There's a very easy access to productions. So we look at Shenzhen as a model, and to see how the three principles can go to the industrial level. So then, and we take that as a model, and then we look around to see if is this just unique to Shenzhen, or is this applicable somewhere else? So we're starting to find in the same example around China. So whether it's a rural village who discover internet, who discover productions, who starting to share, that would be one. And then my recent work has been around this small electric vehicle. It's also happened in pretty much the same way. And outside of China, we're also starting to see the same pattern emerging particularly in Africa. So yeah, things has been excited to look at the borders between the more individualistic expression-oriented maker movement and how they manifest into industrial ecosystem. So yeah, pretty long answers for what I have been up to.
So you continue to work on soil?
Yeah. So for the past years, well, because of I moved to Shanghai in 2003, so make my home here, but my office is in Shenzhen. And for last year, I spent more times in Shanghai, but still running soil.
Great. So I see that two persons enter the room, Tiberius, but it is Jeremy. I can see because I am sharing the screen.
Yes, and Anthony, he's a member of Sensorica. I just broadcasted the event and he probably captured it.
Oh, okay.
Thanks for coming,
Okay.
Anthony. Yeah.
So it will be amazing if we could start a chat between, let's say, Binai and David, considering the experience that both of you guys have in the field of, large projects and projects that has a lifetime like 10 years or more. Binai, do you have some insights about sustainable transportation, which is the main project or one of the subjects that David are working right now more?
Mr. Gupta. Is he muted, maybe? Can't find the unmute button.
Excuse me?
Sorry, I was just trying to fix the video light because it's kind of dark in here.
Okay.
Okay, right. Hi. Sorry, I'm just moving around the hardware. I couldn't hear because I was running off to the storeroom to get this thing. Where are we at? What am I meant to be doing?
Yeah, I am saying that considering your experience and David, you guys could have a very interesting chat considering all the amazing projects that you did. And for example, what about the fact that the projects about the exayurt, to get, for example, in the USA in that event, what is the name? Excuse me, Binai? The event that comes year by year?
Oh, Burning Man.
Yeah, the Burning Man. So I think that the goal of them is to create an environment that is free of pollution. And then there is a lot of people that arrives over there with their bikes, with their cars, etc. How you are dealing with that situation last years in a way that is improve the situation of the region?
I'm not.
Yeah.
I do almost nothing, right? I mean, the whole point of the distributed aspect of the Hexier is we published the designs, we put out training materials, we built units, we showed people how to build units, and now they self-organize to bring something like 10,000 units out to the Burning Man every year. So it's a very large-scale distributed manufacturing process, and the units are used year after year after year after year. So it's a big push to get these things made, but that push is not being made by me. It's not being coordinated by me. It's literally decentralized manufacturing to the point where you can hardly tell that there's a Hexiar project at all, because the skill transfer to that community is complete. And at that point, they're training each other and we don't have to train them. It's been 100% successful transfer of the knowledge. And, there's a lot more to do, right? I still want to get some refugee camps done here, but to that Burning Man community of, say, 100,000 people, of which, say, 75,000 turn up any particular year, inside of that community, the knowledge transfer is complete. They can do it themselves, and they demonstrate that every year when they do it themselves. It's kind of great.
Yeah, that is the point that I think that could be explained or could be imagined by David, how to achieve, how to approach a distributed system of transportation to that big event, for example.
Yeah. So, well, I think Burning Man has a really good illustration of the once you can spread the knowledge, and people can build it. People can start into very experimenting with the design, and then you get to come together and discuss it.
This is interesting because we found they're very unwilling to experiment with the design.
Really?
So we published a set of designs in 2005, which were, let's just say, not the way that we would do it now. And we've been totally unable to get people to stop building that 2005 design. It's super annoying because Burning Man is quite a high pressure environment. They know that design works and they're not willing to take the chance of doing something that they don't trust. So even though we say, hey, this is a better design, you should build the better design, they just keep building the traditional one because it's a bit cheaper and it's a bit easier in the short term. And they know 100% what its properties are. Yeah, it's weird. I mean, it's not that there's no innovation, but the innovation is so much slower than I expected. They've become really conservative, which is super weird.
Yeah. So I'm going to give a little background on the very particular sectors of the electric vehicle we have been working with. So around 10 years ago, this low-speed electric vehicle. Well, one way to look at them, they are glorified golf cart. A little bit larger than golf cart. And more formally to look at it is they fit into the definition of the L6E and L7E in European standard, and then the neighborhood electric vehicle standard in the US. So this electric vehicle is the untold story of the China EV story, the whole China EV narrative. They are not fancy. They are not competing with Tesla. None of the company has ever been heard of outside of China. But one of the interesting thing is in the past 10 years, they put about 12 million of those cars on the street, mostly in rural China. And the funny thing about that is those cars still have no legal standing in China. Not legal, and they are not illegal. They have this weird legal standing. That's a very good videos online. It's called China's Tiny Car by Wall Street Journal. Yeah, I should have brought the picture. I should bring the pictures. But anyway, this emerging out of the solving the need of older people who lives in the 3rd, 4th, 5th tier city and rural areas. Typically, they ride motorcycle. They have this open air tricycle. And as things starting to improve, so companies starting to come up with what you do is you cover up the car, and you make them 4-wheel, and that's the beginning, and sell them for $1,000, $2,000. And most of these cars are pretty capable. They can go up to about 45 kilometers, 30 miles an hour. With one charge, you get to ride them for about 100 kilometers. So the industry is starting to boom because they address the transportation they address the transportation need, and they are at a very good price point. And over the years, they just keep growing. They just keep growing. And since 2015, the central government of China has been talking about, yeah, we need to have a standards. But well, for the past 6 years, they never. 3 versions of the standard has been proposed, and none of them get passed. So, but again, it solves a problem. It has a market, so it continues to grow. And just if you go on Google and put in LSEV, low speed electric vehicle, and China, you see a lot of crazy image as they grow bigger. I mean, we are talking about companies starting to hitting into the 500,000 car a year scale. 1 million car, I think some of them is getting to 1 million car scales at this point, and they're starting to go crazy. So can you imagine this company who just basically put in a case around just a golf cart, and when they get really big, when they're starting to have the scale to produce tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of this a year, they're starting to get fancy. So, well, as all the bottom-up industry goes, when they're starting to look at how they can improve, they take inspiration from the brand they know. So now we have low-speed electric vehicle version of Bugatti. They're beautiful. They're about half the size of real Bugatti, and they go for about $3,000. They take the big car, they miniaturize them, and then they build them. So they go around, they build in mini hammers. They build mini hammer, they build mini Audi V6, V8. And they go so crazy, miniaturize everything. They even miniaturize the Mini. So we have a 2C Austin Mini electric version.
Beautiful, beautiful.
And when this gets built up, it has the characteristic of this very open Chinese ecosystem. Everybody goes in to make something they are good at. So company make motors, specialize into motors. They make battery, they specialize into making battery. So every part in the car, you can get it from multiple vendors. The frame, the casing, everything. And that's how they get evolving so fast. And again, like all the industry coming out from bottom up, people don't really care that much about intellectual property. So things get emerged, frame gets shared, casing gets shared, design gets shared, and that's how they get to move. They get to move so fast in terms of iterating the design. So build on top of that, we're now starting to push the notions of how do we get this into the hand of more people? How do we get this into looking at how we futures of the transportations? So one thing we're starting to organize is this ideas of the mobility co-op. So if we're starting to coming back to thinking about mobility, if we're looking back at the beginning of the automobile, it's every small town in Europe, small cities in the US, everyone has a car company. Everyone has a small car company, or not even a car company, a small car workshop who customer build car for the people in the city. So you get very short, you get people in the local working on their car, even though they bring in part from outside, but a lot of things in the car is built locally. How do we get back to that kind of the environment to push the electric vehicle? So we already have that characteristic. If you come to China, we can go to this province called Shandong. Every city, just about every city in that province has 10, 20, 30 company building this small electric vehicle. So if we take this as an open supply chain and we're starting to look at how we would build a car company today, is a city can organize the car building as cooperative. You bring in what's needed for the material. What cannot be provided in the city, you bring them from the outside. The car gets built, designed, built, customized for the local conditions. Having the co-op maintain it, having the co-op operate them. And in today's environment, it goes to also the digital side of this. You get to do car share, people get to operate them for whatever gig economy job is available today, ride sharing, delivery, and the car started to be a part of the car is no longer something you buy from outside, because if we look at what we have as a transportation today, most of the city in the world, you buy car from the outside, not just paying the transportation costs, that's also licensing, that's also all that restrictions in terms of how you work with the big brand company. And on top of that is the majority of the transportation service now goes to a large internet platform company. If we're starting to reverse that to coming into the same, to bring them into a space where people can build car, maintain car, operate the car, sharing the car, and starting to look at how we design car to be better for the local environment. And that's the things we try to experiment to build on top of this to build on top of this open ecosystem. Kind of looking at a makerspace and how we move from a makerspace where people come in to share interests to an industrial cooperative where people comes in and not just build things, but also maintain things, operate things, and build a solid business, and as well as the basic service inside the city. So that's the way to look at how do we make the future transportation more sustainable. And on top of that is do we really need 4 tons monsters like the F-150 from Ford? It's very interesting is I actually did the calculations for the material to build one Ford F-150. We can build about 10 to 12 of those small cars. And for majority of the small city transportations, it's easier to build, it's lower cost to maintain. And the most importantly, it's a much easier to park.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I would like to make a comment here and maybe have Vinny follow up because I know he's big on that. What I see here is nice, interesting development coming out of China, but it seems to me that China is rediscovering capitalism at the local level and a more decentralized, the original form of capitalism. Because what I'm hearing is that, yes, there is collaboration, low intellectual property pressure. That was the case when, back in the days in the US when we didn't have computer systems and information was not so centralized. People were copying each other because it's very hard to enforce intellectual property. And also regulations, lack of regulations or regulations way behind the technological advancement. And it gives room for large, wide experimentation. But the economic model, like the way we innovate collaboratively, stealing from each other ideas and design and using parts from this open, like we said, open supply chain, that's fine. There's nothing new there. But how do we produce, distribute, use, maintain these things, right? So what we see today, we see the emergence of the commons, for example. We see new forms of property that emerge. This little car is built to be owned, right, by an individual. So we're not changing the fundamentals of the economic system behind if we make cars, doesn't matter how big and how small, to be sold as a commodity and owned by people and used as private property. We haven't changed the nature, right, of capitalism. We can think about cars that are designed to be shared, for example. We could think about different types of organizations for production and maintenance that are not necessarily this private enterprise, but something like an open and collaborative network like Sensorica experiments with. And that's just my comment, is like, this is really cool, and it's really nice, but it looks like a voyage in time, and I don't see the disruption and moving away from an economic system that brought us where we are. You know what I'm saying? So reinventing it, I don't see how we can escape it. So I would like Vinny to, because I know he has a broad futurist views, and he really understands the economic systems. I'd like to get his input on that.
Sure. I think you're still sharing screen, so people probably can't see me.
It's not me. It's okay.
There we are. Okay, cool. That's probably there. Sorry, I'm sitting here in the dark because it's kind of dark outside. So, I mean, the first thing is, this is fantastic, David. I mean, this is just amazing. I don't know if you know, I have a background in energy policy. I spent many years at Rocky Mountain Institute. And in the 1990s, Rocky Mountain Institute was pushing the idea of ultra lightweight hydrogen-powered electric cars that were designed for short-run manufacturing. That company was called Fiber Forge, I think it became known as, and before that it was Hypercar. So then there was the River Simple outfit, which was a Porsche-backed effort to do a small electric car that was designed for short-run manufacturing. They took a crack at it for a while. And then, of course, like, none of these projects really got momentum. And then, along comes the Chinese manufacturing economy, and they eat the problem for breakfast and ship a working solution. It's fantastic. So yeah, I mean, it's just, I'm really glad to see this happening. I mean, the notion that the first saving is simply that the vehicles are very small. So rather than having the passenger be 2% of the vehicle mass, the passenger is now 20% of the vehicle mass. That immediately gives you an enormous efficiency breakthrough. Then the fact that they're electrical, the fact that there's an existing short-run manufacturing. Do you know this book, The Second Industrial Divide? Have you come across this? So it's kind of the Bible of decentralized manufacturing. It studies mostly Italy after World War II, when they produced the Vespa motorcycle in exactly the kind of decentralized approach that you're describing being used in China to make these small vehicles. And the trick of this is, how long does it remain in this gear where it's many, many, many small firms doing it, versus having a large car company come in and take over. And a lot of that comes down to the amortization of the cost of R&D through sharing of information. So, if all of these companies are sharing information and sharing learning, and you have this very, open approach to intellectual property that you described, it may be that there is never a Ford of small electric cars, and they remain, grassroots innovation and decentralized manufacturing, decentralized ownership of manufacturing, kind of micro-capitalism. And on the point about, well, is micro-capitalism just more capitalism? Sure, but when the ratio of power between the consumer and the producer is a factor of 100, if the producers begin to do bad things, you could keep them under control, right? When the ratio of power is between the consumer and the producer is a factor of 100,000, and they're on a different continent, it's very, very difficult to exert any kind of meaningful consumer pressure. So small companies, I think, are fundamentally easier to make ethical than large companies. And if we lived in a micro-capitalist world, you wouldn't have a situation where Facebook tells the government what to do. So I think this is fantastic all round. Amazing. More of this kind of thing.
I think we're coming back to have one thing is that's another. It's not just the car is not going to be I think in the futures we don't need to make the cars to be sold to individual. They are not very efficient process. You need the factories to make 100,000 of them, distributed 500 of them to each dealers. The dealer to have to allocate a huge garage to store them up to a year or 2 years, and then starting to shipping them off the lot. That's not financially efficient, and that's also not. And in between, it's just way too much of this is just car waiting to be used. The other side of the ship is if we're starting to look at all these transportations, including the car and the digital service on top of them as a fundamental service of the cities, then a better way to organize this is to organize a cooperative, a co-op, which is either a consumer co-op or worker co-op, or we can have both, which actually produce the car locally. Making a car is not, for some interesting reasons, and this always puzzle me every time I talk to have discussions, is if we talk about making a car, especially for those of you guys in the US, huge car cultures. Going back to in the garage, working on a Mustang from the 60s is a pastime. That's a complicated combustion engine car. But electric vehicle is simple. By numbers, it's 1/10 of the components needed to make the electric cars than a gas car. Mm-hmm. But when we talk about making the electric cars in the garage, everybody's like, that's not making it. It's not. And everybody thinks electric car has to be something fancy like Tesla. Has to be autonomous driving, big screens, everything. But at the end of the day, it's a car. Yeah. Making a car is not hard. And we have been doing that for 200 years.
And the electric motor is just, small electric motors work really well and small gasoline motors suck.
Yeah. And if you look at these tiny cars, one thing I always tell people is just imagine that everybody has an RC car. Every RC car says it's 1/6 scale models. And so you think about this small electric car. It's 6 times the larger size than your RC car. And we are comfortable putting together RC car. And it shouldn't be that. It's the same as just putting together this small car. So it makes a very efficient things to move the productions distributed. You probably won't be able to produce all the component in one locale, but that's what the distributed supply chain is for. What can be done locally? The key part is if we starting to thinking about the fundamental shift to this is we're changing the car distribution, production and consumption model. We have a co-op. We order part by the bulk, comes them, assemble them. As soon as they are assembled, they are put into use as a sharing vehicle, as vehicle people can go out and cooperative members can take them, go and performing deliver service, go and perform the ride sharing service. If we're starting to imagine moving there, we are bringing most of the control of the transportation back in the cities. Now we are putting a city's transportation in a pretty fragile state. It gets car from the outside. On top of that, it gets its digital transportation service also from the outside. It's probably not going to happen in places like US or it could happen in Europe. Is the company deciding to pull out of the digital service company decided to pull out of the cities. In the past years, we see a lot of them happening in Africa. Ride sharing service just decided to drop the whole city. That's a ride sharing service called Safe Bada, just because of COVID. So they decided to pull out of Uganda, leaving some 80,000 riders without a platform. And that's fundamental to, right now the digital service is as fundamental as the vehicle itself to a city's transportation. So how do we bring all of this back in the cities, back in the control of a local? Small vehicle can help. Open source digital system can help. And another is we never, because of people are specialized. So in here we see a reverse pyramid kind of the supply chain system. So when you look at the top, there are people making crazy cases, crazy look of the car. But when it goes down and down, when you go to the electric motors, there's still multiple suppliers, but they are much smaller in number, which means they sell much more volume. And that competition actually create incentive for them to innovate, more efficient, more torque, more powerful, more energy saving. Same goes for battery. So openness doesn't really precluding innovations, because
may I ask a question? Excuse me, may I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Uh,
And then Anthony wants to ask a question too, right?
I think the opportunity kind of passed, but I already said it in the chat. I was talking about WikiSpeed.
WikiSpeed. Okay, so we'll come back to that. Leopold, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm sitting in Vienna. My professional background is in software development and electronics. I have been at the FabLab conference in Shenzhen. And of course, I was totally impressed about all the production and the speed and so on. But I was very disappointed about the makerspaces and Fab Labs, because my impression was there is very much of the same. And it's only electronics, and millions of smartphones and in different versions. So I haven't really seen anything new except of the mass production, and I would like to look on the disruption question, and also I would like to talk about open source, because what I see is China is using a lot of open source, but I can't see a lot of contributions to the open source community.
Is there no open source design for these little tiny cars? I guess they're not open source.
Well, they don't slap a license. Well, look at it more as a public domain than open source.
Yeah, if
Yeah.
you don't ever enclose the commons, you don't need a license to reopen the commons, right? You know, if there's no enforcement of copyright or trademark, then at that point, everything is open source pretty much.
Can you get the design from somewhere?
Open source is the
but
restricted
it's-
form of public domain.
But it's also a question of documentation. I mean,
Yes.
in open source software development, I find also a lot of crap on GitHub, but on open source hardware, I can't find almost nothing from China.
I mean,
Yes. The focus is probably on making stuff, making it work, bringing it to people in need, and maybe the culture of commons with the tools and the methodology put in place and the work ethics, you know, or the ethos behind that, maybe it's not present. It's more
no, but there's a mistake we're making, right? In the European countries, you know, we went very hard on intellectual property law for 400 years.
Yeah.
Right? In China, they did not go very hard on intellectual property law for 400 years, right? It was imported, you know, as part of the kind of, you know, integration of China into the global ecosystem. But, you know, my understanding, and David, please correct me here, is that intellectual property is just not really a thing in China for the most part. And at that point, you don't really need open source principles because everything is open by default. I mean, I'm being very crude.
But there's a difference, because you have to be able to actually get the design, especially for something with complex curves like a car. I see these pictures in the video of the manufacturing process, and to design a car like that in SolidWorks or other CAD software is something that I know a little bit about, and you have to actually have the design before you can make this stuff, and you have to design the tools to make the stamped sheet metal parts and all that stuff. And
sure, but I mean,
it's not open source, really.
They're banging these things out, so somehow the problem is solved.
Well, but I think that they're repeating a lot of effort.
This way, it's funny. You can go down to whatever city you are. You can go down to a garage if you are, especially if you are in Europe or North America. You can go down to a garage. You see kids tinkering with car. That's a American classic movie for American graffitis. It's about high school kids.
Yeah, it's a very expensive hobby. I don't think high school kids really get car with it.
They don't have solid work. It's a car frame. There's no menu. The notions of you need all this detail file to work it in the car. It's actually quite interesting. For the longest time, people talked about makerspace as a garage, and garage is place you go in and tinker with stuff, with hacking stuff. And car is actually one of the ultimate things people hack around without any of those things. I mean, people modify car, people hack car. The car modification car show, I think it's called SENA. It happened every year in Las Vegas. It's bigger than CES. It's a common pastime. So
are you driving at the idea that it's already solved? Because what I see, I've been also acquainted with this car repair business, and my dad was deep into it, so always as a kid. And the thing is that you're very much locked into the concept of buying the parts. You can only have certain components that are, and they have to be usually made for your vehicle, and you're very much confined in many ways. So to break out of that by being able to make your own parts in makerspaces, it's something that I found some bike mechanics and some car mechanics. They really like that idea, but they're hitting a wall. They can't get anywhere. Fab Labs just don't cut it. And I don't know. So it's really not solved, you know.
Well, I mean,
David, you asked me to share your screen. It is enabled right now.
Ah, okay.
And first of all, please just let's make a little pause. I want to welcome Jeremy. Jeremy Lent, you're very welcome here.
Hi, thank you.
Okay, so we are continuing this in 10 minutes or 15 minutes. We are going to start the second part of this meeting.
David, these cars are fantastic. I love these things.
Yeah, so anyone wants a Bugatti?
Yeah, but I still see a very, very complex manufacturing process here with an enormous amount of capital and a great deal of labor. It's not something we can repeat in Maker Labs and Fab Labs anytime soon.
No, I mean, it's coming back to look at the history. I would always talk about the history of microcar in Europe. That's probably they run from the 40s all the way up to the 70s until the Henry Ford assembly model gets bring in. Austin, the Austin Mini gets started in the starting productions in UK. Citroën 4CR gets starting to productions in France, and that's starting to consolidate the microcar. But before that happened, microcar is being produced in almost, any sizable cities in Europe has a microcar company. It's called Bubble Car in Germany. Look back at that history. That's actually one of the most beautiful history of distributed manufacturers. That's a lot of empowerment in the localities in terms of the car being made, the local knowledge build up. So we are now with the electric vehicle. We can actually go back to that same environment, and which is, well, I mean, depends on the size of the Fab Lab, but as long as it's bigger than a garage, it's enough to tinker with this. I think we has been getting, I mean, when we're starting to talk about electric vehicle, everybody wants to be the next Elon Musk, and which is not a sustainable ideas. That's a great papers coming out of the Christensen Institute in terms of looking at the small electric vehicle and how they are going to disrupt the large company. Actually, Clayton Christensen, before he passed away, he got into this Twitter fight with Elon Musk because they wrote an article about Elon Musk has been doing Chinese market all wrong. Doing Tesla Model 3 in China is stupid. Elon should move to make, well, low-speed electric vehicle in China because this is what going to get disrupted. And the last year actually proved it. The most popular car in China right now is called a Wuling Mini EV. It's a $6,000 small electric vehicle, and it also Tesla 4-to-1 at this point. So we should coming back to really look at car is easy. Electric vehicle is just or fancy golf cart, rather than having that concept of the very complex, it being a very complex, hard things to build.
Yeah, I mean, this is in many ways the adaptation to a fundamentally less colonialist world. You know, the idea that you're going to take the standard of living created by concentrating all of the world's wealth in half a dozen countries, and then you're going to scale that standard of living globally and call that normal. You know, that's been the Western capitalist delusion. It's been the Western capitalist fantasy that has been exported by American advertisers for generations. And it's total nonsense, right? You can just about imagine a world where, you know, there's a car like this for every 20 or 30 people and everybody has pretty good access to transportation. You can just about imagine that, right? You can't imagine a world in which every single family has an SUV. You know, sustainability doesn't look like finding a green version of hyperconsumption. It looks like raising people's quality of life as far as possible without taking them outside of the sustainability envelope.
Okay.
These
However,
things are great. They're amazing. I'm really happy to see them.
Before I start with Jeremy, let me finish this amazing discussion about transportation, sustainable transportation, with a very little video in favor of the makers and their doubts about how to do manufacturing process. It's very short, and I hope it will be of great insight.
The sound is really low for me.
And my friend, the sound is really barked.
Yeah, sound is not very good. Can you send the link to this video? And we can watch it after.
And then the final step is automation. Now, I personally made a mistake of going backwards on all 5 steps. Multiple times. So I will keep this, yes, multiple times.
Okay, that's it. So we're going to start with the second part of this event. I'm going to introduce to you Jeremy Lent, a friend of mine. I'm very happy to have you here, Jeremy. Welcome. You're very welcome.
Yeah, well, thanks. Thanks for the invitation, Marco. So glad to be here.
Okay, George Monbiot says about him. George is one of the greatest thinkers of our age. He's an author and a speaker whose work investigates the underlying causes of our civilization existential crisis, and explores pathways towards a life-affirming future. Born in London, England, Lent received a bachelor degree in English literature from Cambridge University, an MBA from the University of Chicago, and was a former internet company CEO. Oh, what a surprise. His award-winning book, The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search of Meaning, explores the way humans have made meaning from the cosmos, from the hunter-gatherer times to the present day. His new book, The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe, offers a coherent and intellectually solid foundation for a worldview based on connectedness that could lead humanity to a sustainable, flourishing future. Without further ado, please, Jeremy, you are very welcome to give this audience your presentation, your insights, all about your new book. And of course, it will be amazing if you could just stop a little bit by explaining the first chapter of your book, because here's David Lee, and your first chapter of the book is about Taoism. So it will be interesting to connect some point of views related to that specific chapter.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, well, absolutely. Thanks for that introduction. And I'll be happy to talk just briefly about the book and also about how it relates to Taoism. But I also want to really focus a lot of my attention on the intersection between the kind of stuff I write about and what this whole meeting is all about, and the whole relevance in my mind of the kind of innovative and exciting areas you guys are working on to this kind of big picture that I tend to talk about. And so, you know, I'll talk for a little bit, but then I'd really like to sort of tee off a conversation with some key questions that are really big in my mind, which I'm hoping you all may be able to help me to get a greater understanding of. So the book I just came out with called The Web of Meaning, basically, and the subtitle, by the way, is Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. And what this book really does is it shows how our dominant modern worldview is not just dangerous and basically driving our global civilization to the precipice, but is also just plain wrong. Like, people take for granted some sort of fundamental essences of our worldview, things like that, well, nature is selfish and humans are selfish and competitive, and that's who we really are. And in fact, nature, like what is not human, is really just there as a resource, as basically a machine. The machine metaphor is pervasive in thinking about nature. And as a machine, it's basically just a resource for us to exploit. These are the underlying elements that basically grew. These ideas got really developed in Europe in the 17th century, and along with colonialism and the conquest by these European countries of the rest of the world, they got sort of infiltrated throughout the whole world. So what was once a Western worldview is now like a global dominant worldview. And what this book shows is that actually every one of those things I just said is actually wrong. Like, when we look at modern systems, ways of looking at things, whether it's systems science, systems biology, evolutionary biology, cognitive science, what modern scientists show us is the opposite of all those things. It shows that nature itself is not driven by these selfish genes, that actually it's arises. In fact, the evolution itself had the biggest steps in evolution came about through increases in cooperation between different species. It shows that humans, far from being fundamentally selfish and competitive, what really differentiates us from other primates is that we actually learned to be cooperative. We developed group identity and moral emotions. And that rather than nature being this kind of machine or a resource to exploit, that what we learn from evolutionary biology and systems biology is we're all deeply interrelated with all of nature, and that we share half of our genes with a banana, and that actually there's this animate intelligence that all nature has that is part of who we are as human beings, which is where we need to, which allows us to kind of connect with all of nature and see ourselves as part of a living system rather than separate from this kind of system we're meant to exploit. And to the connection with Taoism, in fact, Taoism, Buddhism, and Neo-Confucian thought interweave through the entire book. But what Marco was talking about is I sort of kick off the book looking at this notion of animate intelligence in nature. And the Taoists had this very profound notion of what they call De, like people know the title Tao Te Ching, which is called the classic of Tao and De. And De is this notion of the innate power of all natural beings and all natural entities. And they act with Wu Wei, which is this kind of effortless action, which humans, because of our cognitive way of thinking, have gotten separated from that kind of Wu Wei way of being. And a lot of the book looks at how we can integrate what we are as human beings with our cognitive abilities with that sort of animate intelligence with all of life. But where my book leads to, when it offers this kind of new worldview of interconnectedness, it leads to this notion of we have to replace this destructive civilization we're in right now. And it ends with this vision of an ecological civilization, like a civilization based on principles of life itself, principles of things like mutually beneficial symbiosis, and principles of like essentially leading to a circular economy, which leads me to a lot of what I'd love to hear other perspectives from this panel about, because one of the things that an ecological civilization needs to be able to show is that it's possible to find our way forward as a global civilization without jettisoning technology, but without using technology to basically exploit more and more of the natural world, but actually to find a symbiotic relationship with technology. And when we look at climate breakdown and ecological devastation we're looking at right now, a lot of people look at this notion of, well, technology will save us through, we can sort of split sort of growth in GDP from our resource use by sort of getting more and more efficient technologies. And that's been shown so far to be completely just a myth, that actually any new developments in technology just lead to more GDP. So, we had that image, right, that video just now of Elon Musk. And so on the one hand, he's disrupting an industry, and he's showing that we can have just as powerful electrical vehicles as fossil fuel vehicles, or even better. And at the same time, he's not reducing the level of consumption that's actually taking place on the earth. And he's offering this notion of this big for-profit corporation, just another one of these entities that are basically consuming the earth at a faster and faster rate. So my big question is, I get so excited by Green Fab Lab kind of vision for two reasons. And I'd love to just hear other people's perspectives on this. One is that I see this notion, just like David was just taking us through, that we can actually really rethink manufacturing. We can rethink making of stuff, so that maybe it is possible to sort of decouple what we actually produce from the consumption that so far has been not able to be decoupled. But just as importantly to me is this notion that as long as we do things within a for-profit system, that will never be decoupled, because as soon as we find a more efficient way to do something, then somebody wants to make more profit out of it and grow the market, and then say, oh, and now we can do this, let's do this and this and this more. And then before we know it, we've actually just, we're just consuming even more, but in a different way. So what I would love is to hear your thoughts on whether the sort of Green Fab Lab vision can actually be used to really establish a different foundation for an ecological civilization, for one which is commons-based, and where as we develop and innovate, that's not being used to make more billionaires like Elon Musk, but actually being used to distribute the wealth of knowledge and understanding throughout the whole global human community. And secondly, can that be done in such a way where we really can reduce our overall footprint, but offer enough sufficiency for basically all 8 billion people in the world to actually be able to live a decent standard of living based on this different form, this different vision of production, basically. So that's kind of my big picture concept, but I'd love to sort of get other people's views on these questions that I field quite a lot when I'm giving talks, and people ask me, like, is this even possible? And I'd love to hear what your experiences are and your sense of what the potential really is.
Jeremy, thank you. I'm going to go first because I only have 10 minutes before I have to jet. But this is precisely how we started the conversation. You were probably not here.
Yeah.
We were talking about Vinny's extruders and how the manufacturing process, the knowledge about the process was totally transferred to different communities, and they took control over that. So it is a design that is now produced in a very distributed way. So that's one example of, production and dissemination of solutions in the form of a material thing, in this case, shelter. How it's done, you reduce the need of a middleman, or the need of a pool of specialized knowledge or specialized capabilities, and then that thing can just spread. And that was also the question I asked to David, looking at these little cars and this grassroots ecosystem of innovation. The question was, are we reinventing capitalism, micro-capitalism, and hyper-local capitalism here? And I don't see an economic disruption moving away from, for example, solutions as commodities. In this case, we're talking about mobility, moving away from private property towards maybe shared property or non-dominion property. That's moving away from capitalism. And I'm just going to drop this here because I will not be able to intervene later. But this is what we do with Sensorica. We're practicing commons-based peer production for the past 10 years, which is understanding how we could engage in material production as open networks based on commons. So if you take, for example, the Bitcoin network, it is a digital service provided by what we call an open value network. Is not a organization, a traditional organization like a corporation or a nonprofit or none of that. And the thing itself, the network that is the support for the service provided, it's not a traditional form of property. Nobody can own the network. People own computers, but nobody can own the network. So we call that non-dominion form of property. So here's something that nobody owns, and here's a different type of organization that is providing a global and very secure service. The question in Sensorica is, can we move that pattern to material production? Okay, where you have a commons, where you have different forms of property, and you're engaging in innovation, production, and dissemination of solutions that, in the case of Sensorica, we're working on material things, but these solutions are not designed as commodities. They're not designed as an ink printer made like the one made by HP, but it's designed more like an open source 3D printer that anybody can make in their garage. So that is not a commodity, but it's a solution to a problem. Gives you the ability to fabricate stuff locally, but it's not distributed. It's not distributed through market processes, exchange processes as a commodity. It's distributed as a commons and locally produced, right? So this is what we're trying to do. So yes, to answer your question, there are solutions. We've been working on this for the past 10 years. And it's nice that you asked this question because we go full circle to at the beginning of the conversation.
Great.
Okay,
Yeah.
I take the post over here about the Green Fab initiative, and I want to give it some basics related why the Green Fab idea appears on a big network, and why it appears in a South American in Bolivia. With a totally different approach, conventionally, talking about the conventional Fab Labs, right? As you know, most of the Fab Labs worldwide are university Fab Labs, which means that the people that attend the Fab Labs just going to learn how to use the digital fabrication machines, and then it's supposed that it is some sort of technological transfer because they are learning how to use it. They are in a process to know how about that, right? But it happens that there is a large amounts of people, like 200 or 300, and there is just one Fab Lab. So the contact with that machines is very spurious, a very short time for each one. And it is like, an oasis in the desert. So they don't have real transfer of the technology. So that is the first thing that we realize. And we also become aware of the situation that most of the original Fab Labs comes from the large institutions, big universities, very expensive universities. So it was beyond our possibilities as, people that comes from the South, people that, has a very limited access to services, basic services. So we bet for inclusivity at this point. And we bet for take into account the very basic needs of the people. So we're going to design the Fab Lab based on that needs and on that foundations of inclusivity. Not to follow a desarrollism, to just imitate what the North are doing on technology. Well, and the second part of what we want to explain here, it is that most of the Fab Labs that use digital fabrication technologies are focused on prototyping, right? And prototyping is not the final product. It is just a prototype. And considering that most of the Fab Labs started with, 3D printing, for example, so there is a lot of waste that is produced on the process of learning something, and then this teeny fact lead us to reflect, to make a deep, in-depth reflection about if the Fab Labs are disrupting the way to create stuff, the way to produce goods, or it is just another piece of the machine that is completely, creating a vogue, destroying our planet. So that is the very foundations of a different approach that starts from an aha moment, because I read a book, which is a thesis from Ramiro Condarco and John Murra, which they are, Ramiro Condarco was a Bolivian archaeologist, And John Murrah is an England archaeologist. And Ramiro proposes a thesis named Theory of Ecosymbiotic Complementarity, which was very deeply connected with indigenous wisdom. And it happens that when this way to produce was, happening in the pre-Hispanic times, there were no scarcity.
Right.
You could, enjoy some fruits because it is stational, and you allow, or because you could pay, imported goods, imported fruit from elsewhere. But in a local economy, you couldn't, expect to have, orange all the time, because it is stational. Meanwhile, in that pre-Hispanic stages, there were all the time, because that ecosymbiotic complementarity between ecosymbiotic niche, and then it was a full abundance of everything. So it led us an in-depth reflection about the artificial scarcity and the consumerism, and then of course the programmed obsolescence that that is driving us crazy, and that is causing a lot of problems in our planet. So finally, I want to say that the term symbiosis caused me an aha moment. So I start to research more, and found that we don't need more Intel inside, but we need more nature inside, algorithms, processes, and designs. And I will going to put just an example how important is to consider this as a foundation. And it is a short history about Angela Belcher, who wins a grant in 1999. And the people says that this project, or her project, was insane, because what she was proposing to do is that she wanted to engineer viruses that could be used to grow electronic circuits and ultimately batteries. So people was, she's crazy, or what happened here? The virus grown batteries Belcher had in mind would charge faster than those we use today, would be produced with almost no toxic waste, and would be partly biodegradable. What she was proposing was a clean, cheap, and natural way to make renewable energy and practical alternative to fossil fuels. What inspired her? The abalone. The large sea snails commonly found on the Pacific Ocean. And she asked about how they make their cells. The process involves principles of bioengineering that will open Belcher's mind to all sorts of application, including eventually batteries, for example. So the abalone had to solve a very challenging problem: how to build a lightweight shell of superior strength using only simple, readily available components. The abalone has evolved an elegant and ingenious solution. First, it brings together calcium and carbonate, which is ubiquitous in ocean. It's a ubiquitous materials in ocean, to form calcium carbonate, which is an abundant mineral compound that is commonly used as a blackboard chalk, right? So chalk itself is a weak material that crumbles easily, but abalone overcomes that structural weaknesses with a two-stage manufacturing processes. To start, it arranged molecules of calcium carbonate into a highly orderly array, forming small crystals. These crystals are far stronger than shock, but they still have 1/3000 the strength of an abalone shell. The abalone shell gives the crystals the strength of steel through the process where it makes and distributes small filaments of protein between crystals, creating a type of adhesive netting that functions a bit like a mortar that holds together bricks in a wall. So because of that, it becomes very flexible and at the same time durable, and gives the shell an incredible dynamic strength.
Mhm.
So it is an amazing biological process that produces magnificent materials from the most mundane elements.
Yeah.
And that's all. What I want to illustrate with that is that it shows that nature, it's not only the best engineer possible, but also it is a great economist, right? So because of that, I think that it is possible to think and to explore an open source symbiotic economy.
I love that that phrase, an open source symbiotic economy. And as you were describing that, Marco, it felt so clear, like the power of what's called biomimicry, right? But then what always goes through my mind is, given this global capitalist context that we all are living and breathing in, what's to stop, say, that a person who designs this this incredible, powerful, new organic approach to computing, whatever, what's to stop them doing an Elon Musk, patenting it, and then rather than making it open source, just basically then going ahead and trying to become that next sort of tech billionaire. And so that's one issue. And then the other issue, and I'm asking these because I think they're just essential for us to really offer the world basically a different vision. And so the other thing is, how do we move away from this thing that's called Jevons paradox? And I don't know if you're aware of that phrase. It's from this 19th century economist, Jevons, who, when he was looking at, how the British were developing more and more sophisticated technologies around the steam engine and more efficiency and stuff. But the paradox was that every time somebody said, let's find this way to make it cheaper, or we need to use less work or less resources to get this solution, as soon as they came up with that, they ended up consuming more, because it just enabled them to then do more, act more, and expand more. So the paradox is, all these solutions that lead to less cost or less need for materials ends up actually expanding, using even more materials. And of course, that's not a paradox. It's simply the lifeblood of capitalism, because capitalism is all about growing and growing until there's nothing left to consume. So, I love the whole open source and sort of commons-based approach, I feel, is the solution. And I guess one of my questions is, how do we make that so attractive and so that it just expands globally, and rather than being in these sort of small pockets of people who are more awakened to these issues?
Yeah, I want the help of Binay on this matter. But I could say a little bit, just a teeny comment about what happened when you are thinking that the vanguardist ecologists, the vanguardist thinkers that promotes a lifestyle, a green lifestyle, it is not like that. It is just more of the same because they want more growth, they want more financial gain, they want more productivity.
Right.
And what I'm talking about? I'm talking about, for example, circular economy, which it is the trend right now. You know, everybody is involved in a circular economy project, especially in Europe, especially in USA, or including China, who is the second investor on this kind of approach. And it's about, you know, zero waste, zero emissions, and, you know, increase the productivity to produce more, but with less. And yeah, that is all very interesting. But you need to take into account that there is negative externalities, right? So the materials that big companies are using in order to produce an iPhone, for example, it comes from Africa. It comes from, you know, very tiny and underserved communities in Congo, for example, that is producing coltan, and then they never ever will get a sense of or the richness that produce the coltan. They remain poor and they remain contaminated, and their land will become just a crater, and sooner or later they will be exposed on their own land because the climate abroad. So that is why I think we need another level of circular economy, and that is my research is about, you know, open source symbiotic economy that goes beyond and just think the global economy and the global planet as an organism that is totally interrelated, and it is not about just focus on some companies on the north part of the planet, but in the whole organism.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Marco. Vinay, I see that you put your video back on. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about some of those questions that I was asking about.
Sure. I mean, the bottom line is that the world is simply run by demons, right? Now, whether you think of this as being a literal spiritual truth or a metaphor doesn't really matter. But, you know, in a position where you have, I don't know, what, 5–10% of the world's GDP spent on manufacturing arms, while we've got 1 billion people starving and 3 million people will die of hunger this year, the world is run by demons. And anytime we get close to having nice things, the tendency is for us to get overrun by people capturing whatever value is that is being created in the commons, and they hoover it up, attempting to build their fortresses to protect them from the horrific bullshit outside.
Right.
Right. So, you know, the problem here is not just the bad guys. The problem is all the people that are so afraid of the bad guys, they'll do unethical things to protect themselves from the bad guys. And the predominant way that we protect ourselves from the bad guys is money. Because that's health insurance. It's the ability to get a house that has a landlord who isn't a bastard. It's the ability to buy yourself out of trouble when something horrendous happens, like your city floods and you need to relocate. You know, so the only way that we're going to get the commons to work is in the areas where the commons has the ability to beat capitalism at its own game. Right? We've seen this very successfully with Linux. But I remember having dinner with Richard Stallman one time, and he was just bitterly complaining that because of the legal bug in GPL v3 that did not require people who were providing software as a service to release their code changes in the way that it did for people that were selling software, $1 trillion had marched out the front door of the open source ecosystem, well, the free software ecosystem, directly into the hands of Silicon Valley. You know, Stallman said, look, the entire .com world, it's basically just taking the economic benefits of free software and privatizing them, because these people are not forced to release their source code as a result of building businesses which are like 95% open source software and then 5,000 lines of code written on top of it. It's a very tough thing to face. And then we have to say, okay, if we assume that there is no human goodwill at all, where can we beat these people at their own game? And I think the electric cars that we just saw are a fantastic example of that.
Yeah.
You know, every single one of those cars which is sold is making it a little bit less likely that the world is going to be dominated by gasoline cars in the future.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it seems that open source design basically does exactly that, because it, I mean, the way that capitalism works is to a large degree through the whole, I mean, the way that any sort of technological interface with capitalism works is to a large degree through the patent system, right? Through sort of setting up enclosures around intellectual property. And so it seems that open source design is one of the ways that just totally undermines that, and that actually can't be stopped by the whole capitalist monster, if you will, because it's just available, and so it can then get re-enclosed. So does that make sense to you?
It can't get re-enclosed, but it can get ring-fenced. You know, the extraction of value from open source software, like, you know, Apple Macintoshes, under the hood, they're running Darwin, right? Darwin is a fork of FreeBSD. So did the FreeBSD people, you know, get their mortgages paid because they made FreeBSD? No, there's no license fee, it's open source. So nearly all of the value in the FreeBSD ecosystem has been captured by Apple. And, you know, that oversight where the licenses were insufficiently political to prevent people working their way around them to do this kind of stuff, you know, that's why the open source movement is largely made of people that are poor.
Yeah, but
right?
so then what about some of those further developments in open source contracts that say you can use it freely, but only if you maintain that open source, you know, for any other work that you do, like something along those lines?
I mean, I think there's always the potential for doing this kind of stuff, right? The potential is always there. It just has to work, you know? Like, you know, somebody has to do the lawyering has to stand up in court, somebody has to make something that's worth a bunch of money because of that lawyering. Whoa. Who's that weirdo? My God, what's happening?
There's two of you.
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
It will be ready for a fast diffusion lately. Continue, please. Sorry.
So basically, and I mean here, yeah, I think the great lesson is that we failed, right? The existing set of tactics haven't worked. We've been outcompeted by capitalism at every step, and most of us are broke, bored, and tired. You know, the movement's really middle-aged. We haven't gotten a younger generation to be massively enthused, and very few people are making their living in open hardware. I basically gave it up 6 years ago because I'd been homeless 4 times. I was over 40 and I was getting ground into the dirt by poverty. And I went off and went back into tech. And, you know, I don't consider that to be a personal failure, but I definitely consider it to be a failed experiment. And I think that what we have to think about doing is encouraging the younger generation that are going to come up and try and live in an ethical way to learn the lessons from the failure of this movement, understand that they have to be able to make a pretty decent middle-class living doing whatever it is they're doing, and then they have to get much, much more aggressive in the marketplace and much more aggressive legally. So I think we need to start thinking about things like patent pools. I think we need to start thinking about guild structures. You know, I think we need to get basically much more mercenary and much more militant if we're going to be able to protect our turf in future, where we want to do open innovation. You know, we want to operate in a different way, but we don't want to wind up enslaved by the system in the process. And I don't have an immediate suggestion of how that works, but I think it's a legal challenge first. You know, the legal perimeter is the thing that erects the fence. And then within that fence, you can then do some gardening. Do you know about Jaron Lanier's book?
I haven't read it, but I know of it. Yeah.
So Lanier basically says, look, you know, if you take down all the moats, what happens is that the biggest, meanest thing in the environment simply winds up dominating the entire landscape, right? You know, he talks about this concept of middle-class dignity, and middle-class dignity occurs when you have a sufficiently strong moat that whatever the local form of hypercapitalism is, it can't come in and strip all the value out of whatever it is you do for a living. I think that is a really, really important concept. I don't know how we use that concept to solve the problems that we have, but I'm pretty convinced that he got this right. And then what we've got to do is try and figure out how do we build much, much more assertive moats around the things that we're attempting to turn into commons. You know, I think we need to think of the commons as going from something that you protect with a little fence to being something that you protect with machine gun emplacements. And I almost mean that literally. I mean, if you think about Rojava, Rojava really embodied an enormous amount of the potential hope for the kind of commons-based society movement. You know, a lot of people had their eggs in that basket. I know people that went down there and fought, not many, but a few. And, you know, they got torn to pieces while the entire world was sat there with its hands in its pockets. You know, it was there, it lasted a few years, it got wiped out, and it got wiped out by freaking ISIS. While the Western world sat around with its hands in its pockets because the plea for Kurdish independence also stood on the toes of the Turks, and we cared about the Turks more than we cared about the Kurds. But, you know, for the radical politics, you know, of the kind of democratization of society, you know, new forms of feminism, you know, that entire political caucus was very shy about supporting Rojava because Rojava was a tough, tough place and they made a big territorial claim. And then when Rojava went down, they were largely unmourned. So I think that that is a pretty strong indicator that we are unable to hold ground. Because if this stuff was going to work at scale, that's where it was going to work. If you were going to see an economy that ran on commons-based peer production, Rojava is probably the best shot that the world had, because it's a place where their kind of government structures were 100% radical and willing to do crazy new things to make their economy work. They could potentially have gotten a whole bunch of those kind of ideas actually implemented if they'd lasted long enough. And yet, you know, it was there and then now it's gone. And that was kind of like our equivalent of the Spanish Civil War. You know, the anarcho-syndicalists got a couple of years of operations in Spain, and then they got wiped out by the fascists. The anarcho-syndicalists, once again, get a couple of years of operations, they get wiped out by ISIS. So I think that what we need is the other half of this, which is, you know, Taoism is intimately connected with the martial arts, and if you fuck with those people, they break your arms. You know, Zen and the samurai intimately interwoven. I think that we have been far too nice for far too long while the world is burned on our watch. And the unwillingness to litigate in an aggressive way and rip to pieces the organizations which are damaging the commons, that's a problem that we have everywhere from river protection right through to open source software. And when Richard Stallman dies, because he's pretty old now, I think the free software movement and its values will be almost entirely forgotten. So, you know, we really need to start thinking about the future as like, okay, the world is hell. We've tried being nice to people. We're unable to protect our boundaries. The value keeps being sucked out of the commons by bastards. How are we going to get a grip? And here, I think we basically have to figure out how to get the lawyers from places like, what's called the Center for Automated Legal Agreements, Koala. You know, we need to start thinking about getting people like Koala involved to figure out how we do things like create patent pooling and how we get much more aggressive open source licenses that actually work. So not a doctrine of hope.
Excuse me. It's not, we are on the final minutes of this event, but we're going to continue, but in another room, right?
Except I have a hard deadline also at the end of the hour, so I won't be able to continue, unfortunately, Marco.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah. But let me just leave one thought to follow on from what you're saying. I really appreciate everything you've just been sharing, Vinay, and that really is helpful to me, just from my understanding of some of your context. But one idea that was coming through my mind when you were describing the sort of failed experiments and all the different things that look like they could potentially work is really just kind of how life itself has evolved, and this recognition that what I think evolution does in life is it tries and tries and tries, and things fail continually. But then when one new thing actually starts to work, like some of the great steps in evolution in history, whether it's the nucleated cell or multicellular organisms or or the rise of the nervous system. It might only be one breakthrough, but it can be so powerful that before long it pervades the entire global ecosystem. And so my sense is that every one of these failures is not necessarily itself a failure. I mean, I recognize that for the people involved in the actual stuff that's happening, it feels like it failed. But every one of those doesn't have to be a failure if we learn, if we can only apply some of what you're thinking and saying, what is the lesson we can learn from this that went wrong? And what is the lesson we can learn from that went wrong? And rather than say, okay, we failed, we've got, okay, this is one more place where we can connect something up, a little bit like the abalone that Marco was talking about, and finally find something that actually works, that can then, as soon as that happens, it can really take over dramatically.
Absolutely. I mean, I would agree. It's just a question of semantics. Whether you think of it as, learning or failing one way or the other, we're going to have to change our tactics and we'll do something different, and hopefully it will work this time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. That really taught me a lot. I appreciate it.
Sorry, it's an unpleasant lesson, but that's kind of how I roll.
Yeah.
Bad news, Bear.
All right. Well, listen, Mark, I just want to thank you for inviting me to this group, and I'd love to explore more. And just to put it out there, the next book I plan to write a couple of years from now that I'm starting to work on is actually called Future Flourishing: Pathways to an Ecological Civilization. And things like what you guys are doing, I really hope will be, a central theme throughout this book. So I'm very open to really hearing about both examples of failures, quote unquote failures, that things didn't go right, and also examples of what's maybe working that needs to be scaled. So I'm just, please, Marco and others, just funnel ideas my way if at any time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. And thank you, Binay, David, Anthony, Richard, Dabeiba, and welcome, Anna, and see you in the next room. Please follow the link. The link is over there.
Can you post the link in? Where's the next link?
Wow, paste
in the link to the next room, please.
I will send you by mail just now.
Okay, that works.
Okay. Bye-bye.